Thanks.
Woo!
Hey, baby.
Ladies and gentlemen, baby breakers.
Woo! Listen, Boogie Woogie Man feel good.
He's going for that figure four. He's got the figure four.
Randy Macho Man Savage now steps into the ring.
Kill me! Kill me!
Oh, yeah!
I've devoted my whole entire life, from 15 years old to what I am right now, to the wrestling world. And there's not a damn thing that I regret.
What Harley is he's a student of hard knocks.
One of the toughest guys to ever lace up a pair of boots.
Harley commanded a lot of respect and got it.
Harley race. Hell of a world champion, a gentleman, and a guy who brought a lot of class to the belt and to the business.
Move for move, hold for hold, without question. He's the smartest guy in the ring, and probably the best.
Great in-ring performer. And whenever I say great, he was one of the all-time greatest.
I would say Harley Race was the greatest champion ever.
He was no nonsense.
Whatever you've heard about anybody smarting off to Harley Race, it didn't happen.
Night after night came in and had an incredible match, and he was taking those slams on the floor and the backwards bump over the top rope.
Harley would sacrifice his body.
One of the greatest professional wrestlers I ever saw in my life. A performer who was able to be so strong and so capable, he would have the audience right here.
Harley Race's legacy, the world's fastest beer drinker, world's fastest car driver, world's greatest everything. And I'll tell you what, I think he is.
You're looking, talking, and listening to the greatest wrestler on the face of God's green earth, whether it's now, before, or after. It's me. Well, I was born April 11th, 1943. In Maryville, Missouri. And I had one older brother, 4 years older, about close 4.5 years older, and 4 sisters younger than me. One of my buddies at that point in time, who's since passed, and I'm not going to mention any names, but we wound up in a position where he ducked, I punched the principal, and that got me, I think I was 13, just ready to turn 14, and by the time I was turning 15, I got involved in the wrestling part. My parents moved to Iowa, Clarinda, Iowa. When I say moved away, it's maybe 50 miles away. And I made up my mind when I saw it on television for the first time that was what I was going to do.
Harley, how he broke in as a teenager, was working on the farm of the Zabiscos. And if you stop and think about farm work, is so demanding physically anyway. And then Harley trained after he worked on the farm all day And if that didn't toughen you up, I don't know, or it'd either kill you or toughen you up, one of the two.
Harley was able to train with the Zbyszkos. Stanislaus Zbyszko and his brother in Missouri, they had retired and had a farm there. And talk about a tough way to train. You had to be tough just to go through, my God, being stretched by two of the great old-timers from the turn of the century in a barn in Missouri. How tough did you have to be to go through that?
The Zbyszkos, Waldek Zbyszko and Stanislaus Zbyszko, two former world champions, and from back in the 20s and the 30s, and unbelievably hard work. And I think they probably traded some ring time for a lot of hauling hay and cleaning out stalls and doing everything else that they needed on the farm. But to be able to train again, that goes back to the history of Harley. So many people probably going to be watching this documentary or even read history probably don't know much about the Zbyszkos. And they were as tough as anyone that has ever wrestled. And to get training and to learn the ropes, no pun intended, from two great brothers that were world champions back in the, that wasn't old school. They were there before the old school burnt down. They were some of the pioneers of modern day professional wrestling at the turn of the century. And for Harley to go to learn the early days from them had to be invaluable.
A little over a year later, I had my first match, which wasn't on television. The first match was in a carnival. Gus Karras had the carnivals and stuff back then.
Pro wrestling in America came from the carnivals, but Harley was one of the last guys to really start in the carnivals and make the transition to pro, because he did it in the mid-late 50s. A lot of the carnival days in the teens, 20s, and 30s shaped a lot of the wrestlers.
They had the challenge, take on all comers thing as well, but then they had girls there, they had midgets, they had tag. If they couldn't get a local to challenge out of the audience, then they would put on matches and sell tickets, and they were packed in those tents right up to the ring apron. And the crazy thing about that is you never knew who it actually was coming out of that crowd to challenge. Some of those big farm boys were strong as bulls, and you didn't know that this might have been the state amateur wrestling champion for all you knew, right? Because you knew no background, just somebody raised their hand and said, I'll take this guy on.
The carnival wrestling was a combination of a wrestling show and a wrestling shoot.
The carnivals would come into town and they take on all comers. $100 if you can last 10 minutes, or $1,000, or whatever it may be. So these guys had to really learn how to protect themselves.
Working those fairs, you're scared. Legitimately, because first of all, the promoter's money is on the line.
If you didn't, then whoever you were working for at the time had to pay them, and by him paying them meant no pay for you. So you just kind of made up your mind that you weren't going to lose, you were going to put that guy to sleep.
But a lot of times, the local would be a plant. And so Harley at various times was either the guy who did the challenges, or when he was younger and a teenager, he was the plant in the crowd. And at a carnival, it may be a small town, but you didn't know everybody. So if a guy was dressed up like a local guy and go, hey, I could whip him, why don't I take that challenge? Well, then the people would start getting behind him. And so Harley worked both sides of the fence, and that's where the carny terms came from, the language carny that now has been bastardized by the rappers.
The centerpiece of those carnivals and the at shows was always the wrestling match, whether it was two guys wrestling each other, for a regional title or for a world title, or was it taking on all comers?
It was an insulated world. It was a secretive world because a lot of the games were rigged, like the at show, the wrestling matches were rigged. And that was how pro wrestling and a lot of its customs developed. So Harley got a unique education in how to work people and also how to work or shoot, depending on the situation. And he was one of the last guys to do so because that faded away by the 60s.
Gus was probably as close to me back at that point in time as my own father was. Gus treated me great.
Gus was based in St. Joe, Missouri. Never saw Gus when he didn't have a coat, suit, tie on. and had his little fedora. But he was a gentleman, nice guy, and he was good to the boys. I mean, to the best of my recollection. And I know he loved Harley.
He was a regional guy, 300 some odd pounds, and a very, very large guy. And one of Harley's first jobs in wrestling was he drove Happy Humphrey around.
I met him the first time in St. Joe, Missouri, in the office of Gus Karras. Humphrey was there to tell Gus that the person that drove him and made sure he got from point A to point B had left, and he was stranded. Gus looked up and saw me, and he said, "Harley, you want a job?" I said, "Sure, doing what?" He said, "Driving Humphrey." I said, "No, why not?"
On his best day, after a heavy diet, Happy Humphrey was 600 pounds. He was 700, 800. He topped out at 1,000 at one point when he had already finished wrestling, and then he had the surgery and lived another 25 years. He was down to 220 pounds or whatever. But his name was William J. Cobb. He was from Macon, Georgia. But he was the heaviest man in the world. And obviously his job options were limited. So he became a professional wrestler, and his mobility was limited also. So it was basically an attraction, as they used to say. But Harley's job was driving Happy Humphrey from town to town in this, customized car that had no back seat. The front seat was in the back seat because he couldn't, fit in it. And Harley would drive him from town to town, and also was his opponent.
I had been very, very fortunate to be able to get a driver's license at the age of 15.
He was so big that Harley talks in his book, he had to literally, to bathe him, he had to lay him down, use a mop on him, and then shoot him with a garden hose. And so obviously you get a close relationship with a guy when you're, bathing him with a garden hose. And that may be the toughest thing that Harley Race ever did.
I would hose him off fairly decently, but there was areas of Humphrey that I don't think were ever washed. I drove Humphrey for quite a while, and then Christmas night, I had the wreck that stopped my driving Humphrey, and for quite a while I thought I was totally out of wrestling forever also. I had just got married and had been married less than a month, and I went home for Christmas. Headed there, a semi-trailer had started to pass another one, and we're on a 2-lane highway. And as I came up the hill, he came over the top of the hill over right in my lane. Well, he turned the nose of his truck back to the other side, and I tried to turn away, but it was more or less a head-on. She was killed instantly.
She was pregnant, so lost the baby also, and Harley's, not only his leg, but also his arm was badly injured. They put pins in his arm, they put screws in his knee, but actually at first the doctor said, "You'll never wrestle again, and we're going to amputate the leg."
The person that talked me out of letting them amputate my leg was Gus Karras. And he said, "Let me take you," and I was in Maryville Hospital at the time. He said, "Let me take you to see a specialist, and maybe they can save your leg. It won't have to be amputated." And neither one of us were ever thinking about being able to wrestle at that point in time. So I went to St. Joe, Missouri, and they operated on my leg and arm. I got, like I said, 4 metal screws just below the right knee, and 2 braces and 12 pins here. And I guess, say from there, the rest of it's history.
And they were able to put the pins in and the screws in the arm and save his, not only his career, but his leg. And that was before he really even became a main event wrestler and took bumps for 25 years. So it's just incredible. He's a miracle.
My first recollection of Harley was the horrible car wreck that I believe killed his first wife, and put a plate in his arm, and he, you know, he was in bad shape himself. And then after hearing about this and then meeting him and watching him work in the ring, I thought, wow, you know, maybe it was somebody else that, you know, that was in that horrific car wreck. But no, it was Harley, which again says a lot for his intestinal fortitude and his drive and focus to be a top-flight professional wrestler.
Everyone thought my wrestling career was over, including me. My very first match back, I had almost forgot about him at that point in time, you know, as far as what he had said. And when it dawned on me and came back to me, I told Gus Karras, I said, I don't care what it costs me, I'll pay for it eventually to you, but I want this doctor here. And Gus made arrangements with him to be able to bring him out of Maryville down to St. Joe and watch me wrestle the first time. And when I did, and it was over with, I introduced the doctor to everybody in the building and thanked him for giving me not only my life back, but my career along with it.
So to get, you know, emotional support, and then to have somebody like Gus stop, you know, that, you know, no, you're not going to amputate that leg. Knowing Harley, I'm sure he felt quite a bit of an indebtedness to Gus over the years.
Gus Karras played a bigger part in wrestling history than one would think from just being a promoter in the Central States. He actually was responsible for Harley Race's career as a main event player. His first break was when he went to the Nashville circuit to work for Nick Gulas and Roy Welch in the early 60s. That's when he changed his name.
I went to Nashville driving Happy Humphrey, and they saw me wrestle for that week, or I think we were there a little over a week at that point. And the promoters there were two of them. There was Nick Gulas and Roy Welch. Nick saw me and asked me if I would come there and wrestle for him. I said yes, but I got to find Humphrey a way to get around. He can't drive himself. So when I was able to put that together with somebody driving for Humphrey, that was where I was going to go.
There was a wrestler in Tennessee at the time named Johnny Long, and he looked somewhat like Harley, and the Tennessee territory was big on brother teams, so Harley became Jack Long and teamed up as the Long Brothers.
This had already been prearranged that I was going to come in. He started talking about bringing his younger brother in, and my name became Jack Long.
And that kind of was Harley's first taste of actually being in a program, being featured in main events. Tennessee at the time did not pay well, but it was on-the-job training. It was experience.
TV had just started getting going real good, you know, across the nation. And the first time I saw on TV, somebody said to my dad, "Why would your son call himself Jack Long instead of Harley Race? Are you trying to make somebody else popular?" And Dad never ever went for that. He was ticked off at that from the very start of it.
He said, well, my dad actually kind of made me think about that. He said, why would you want to do all this hard work and make somebody else famous? So he went back to being Harley Race instead of using a gimmick name.
Vern came to Cedar Rapids, Iowa one night to watch me, which worked out to be great for me because it put me and eventually put me and Larry Henning together as tag teams, and the two of us were very, very good together.
They were a pretty formidable tag team, and whether it was in the AWA or with Vern, or whether it was down in Indiana, you know, wrestling with Wilbur Snyder or the Bruiser, you know, they were as tough as they came. They both had the same kind of style, you know, very methodical, very straightforward, not real flashy, but certainly, I think you could kind of attune them to the Anderson brothers back in the old Mid-Atlantic days, you know, just how they just had everything down almost to a science.
These are both just raw bone, big, rough guys, man. You know, it was so cool because the announcer there, you know, he would always say, hey, either one of these guys could go bear hunting with a switch, and you know, they could, man. You know, they were both just real double tough men.
A couple of tough son of a bitches. They were, you know, they were both right out of that Vern Gagne's territory, Minnesota territory, and they were coming out of there, and I'll tell you what, not many people could touch them. They were tough guys in the ring.
Henning and Race were well thought of because Henning was older. He had already been a pro for a while. He was the power guy. He was 300 pounds, you know, the huge, giant red beard. And then there was Harley Race, who at the time was still a lighter weight guy, taking the big bumps, and he was young, mid-20s.
Harley was a character, and he truly was, and he truly did believe that he was handsome Harley Race. You know, I don't want him to listen to this tape and get mad at me, but I always thought he was pretty ugly.
Pretty boy Larry Hennig and handsome Harley Race, that may have stretched to the limit the dictionary definition of pretty boy and handsome, but that was part of the heat. That's part of the heat, because most of the pretty boy tag teams in wrestling as heels were not that pretty.
To tell everybody you're a tough guy kind of ticks people off, but to tell them you're handsome Harley Race kind of tends to piss them off.
Or as the Crusher and Bruiser used to call them, the Dolly sisters, because of the blonde hair, and you know, and with Hennig the power guy and Race taking the bumps, they were a perfect heel team because there was that contrast. But they had psychology, and obviously Harley at this time, starting as a teenager, already had been around the business for 10 years or more, and he knew what he was doing. So they ruled the roost as far as heel teams in the AWA for the latter part of the 60s.
I mean, those guys were doing things with me in the ring that I thought, my God, you know, I'm going to really do well in this business. I'm quite the genius in the ring. I didn't realize that those guys, and that's what it was back then. Those guys had the ability to take a piece of crap into the ring and make it smell like a rose. And they could do it night after night after night. And they could also beat the shit out of you if they wanted to.
They're probably the precursors to the Road Warriors.
Well, separation came out of another stupid thing on my part. I got involved in another wreck, and as I'm recouping from that wreck, I'm talking to different promoters, you know, across the country.
I think he made the best decision that he could ever make, you know, and what a tremendous jump that was to make that decision. I mean, here's this guy that grew up there and was just still a young kid, you know. Whenever he came through there with Larry Hennig, he was like 18 years old, 19 years old. Just a kid. But man, he wasn't a kid in a ring.
When you're involved in a tag team, you're always talking about you and the guy next to you. But when you really get rolling yourself, you're only talking about one person, and you got one thing in mind. That's the world's title. And that's where I wanted to be.
When he moved back to the Central States, Kansas and Missouri, and actually became an owner, He bought in at, you know, he was smart. He bought in at at the time was a solid promotion and had been there a while, and once again at a pretty early age. So that's when Harley was really noted for his Central States and Missouri title runs and main eventing St. Louis. He was really respected there in the Midwest, and of course, since it was home, you know, it was even sweeter, and he was able to own part of the promotion as well.
Harley, you know, going into the Central State or back to the Central States until what, May of '73, when you know, he met Dory Funk Jr. for the World Heavyweight title.
I don't know how much serious consideration Harley was getting as a future world champion in 1973. I'm sure he was on the list, because in those days especially, the champion wasn't supposed to be the flamboyant guy. They weren't ready in the NWA for a Ric Flair yet. The champion was chosen based on his in-ring ability, and Harley's promos were straight ahead. You could tell he was a tough guy. He was no nonsense. It wasn't colorful. He didn't have witty one-liners. He was straight ahead. He told you what he was going to do, and he did it. Didn't need to be flashy, because a traveling world champion, the challenger was flashy. The local hero, or sometimes even the local villain, was the flashy one, and the champion was coming in to do one thing, and that was retain his title and leave. So Harley's in-ring work fit the style of the NWA World Champions at the day.
You know, after almost 5 years, you know, Dory had a tremendous run as champion. Dory was the champion. He epitomized, you know, that era, and for almost 5 years, you know, to hold the title was tremendous. And, you know, the road can wear everybody down, and, you know, Dory, from my understanding, you know, it was going to be, you know, time for the new champion.
My father had a lot of power. He had a lot of power in the National Wrestling Alliance. Why did he have power? Because he was respected that much. And why did Eddie Graham have that power? Because he was respected that much. I felt that my father was as knowledgeable as anybody in the profession. And talking about my brother being champion, you know, is you hear this. Harley will say one thing. I will say another. My brother will also say another.
Circumstances in 1973 played a part in Harley getting the title, even though he wasn't necessarily intended for it at the time.
It was scheduled, Dory dropping the title, you know, to Jack in May of that year. Jack was getting ready to go to Houston. It was going to take place in Houston for Paul Bosch, and Dory had a reported truck accident on his ranch and was injured.
Dory Funk Jr. being involved in the truck accident, and it was, I don't know, 2 weeks roughly before he was supposed to drop the belt to Jack Briscoe in Houston, Texas. There was questions as to the credibility of what was happening, because Dory's dad, Dory Funk Sr., was a real manipulator, one of the real characters of wrestling. I say it with a smile, because I mean, he was great when I talked to him and to learn from as a kid, but he was a character and he was a manipulator, so you don't know what was going on there.
Dory Funk Jr. was the champion. Jack Briscoe was the designated next champion to replace him, and the match was made. But there was a big rivalry between the Funk family and Jack and his brother Jerry Briscoe. And Jack had worked Amarillo early in his career and thought that the Funks, especially Dory Sr., kind of took advantage of the fact he was an ex-NCAA heavyweight champion by then having Dory and Terry beat him, which is understandable because it was his territory and they were the pro wrestling stars. But it kind of stuck, and there was a rivalry. And so just a couple of weeks before the championship match, Dory Funk Jr. was injured in a pickup truck accident, truck overturned on his ranch in Amarillo. That was the story. That was what was claimed. That there were photos produced of Dory in the hospital with Dory Sr. and Terry. There was evidence that this is what happened, but there's always been a story that Dory just didn't want to, or Dory Sr. didn't want Dory to lose the title to Jack Briscoe. And the NWA World Championship was the most important title in wrestling at the time, so even though it sounds silly today, because everything in wrestling is silly today, back then this was a big deal and it meant something. It meant a lot of money. It meant a six-figure income. It meant prestige. It was your image.
I was on my father's ranch. He said, let's move some cattle. Called Terry out, got him on the phone. And you have to understand what my father's ranch was like. He had an upper plateau, and also there was a lower part where a creek ran through the bottom country. And we were going to bring the cattle up from the bottom to the top. And we had a pickup truck, and I was driving the pickup truck. My father and my brother were on foot, and we were chasing cattle. And we took off after a calf, and watching a calf, our pickup truck ran over a six-foot embankment. That's not far, but when you run a pickup truck off an embankment like that, and you hit the water and the ice, it messed me up pretty good.
Some people believe that, some people don't, and to be honest with you, the only person I think that knows exactly what happened would be Dory.
But my brother did have a wreck go into the creek, and he was physically unable to go down there and defend that match, you know. And in fact, is you know, I mean, that was quite a deal at the time, and it was we took a lot of heat from that because everybody thought it was a work. It wasn't. It wasn't a work. It was the real deal, you know. But because of that incident, because of that thing that was going on then, nobody believed it. Because there was a title change coming up, I figured, well, the Funk screwed everybody, you know, but that's not true. It actually happened.
In that pickup truck accident, I received a separated shoulder, among other things, including facial and head lacerations. So that's the only match I missed in my career, and I could not make it to Houston for the match with Jack Briscoe. And they even, it was the next day. I think my accident was on a Wednesday and Houston was on a Friday, and it may have been on a Thursday and Houston was on a Friday. But they called and they begged my father and said, can't you just get him to come down to Houston and walk in the ring? You know? And I had one shoulder that wouldn't, that I couldn't raise. And there was no way. I was in the hospital for 3 days. So they were very, very upset that I didn't make the match, that I didn't make Houston.
Who knows? Maybe it's a phantom zone. Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. But it's one of those great wrestling stories. I think it's better that nobody actually knows. I think it's better that way because it adds to the history of, you know, the colorful history of wrestling.
I did come back, and I came back wrestling maybe a little bit soon at the request and the pressure of Fritz von Erich, Sam Mushnick, Eddie Graham for that matter, wanted me back in the ring wrestling for the world title, and I did, and I came out, probably came back too early, and went in the ring against Harley Race in Kansas City.
Bottom line, when Dory Jr. finally came back to wrestling, they wanted that belt. The NWA did, Sam did, and he lost the title to Harley Race in Kansas City. Harley, early in his career, had many great matches with Dory Funk Jr., Dory Funk Sr., Terry Funk. There was a relationship there, so I think everybody felt that's the simplest way to do this. We'll go to Harley. And if something isn't right, well, it's our referee.
Even though it wasn't obviously advertised as such, he was an interim champion just to make sure that the title flowed smoothly from one to the other.
Kind of came out of nowhere that Harley Race, who was pretty much known as a very strong regional wrestler, all of a sudden was the heavyweight champion of the world. You know, won 2 out of 3 falls, you know, that night in Kansas City.
Being able to take the title from him worked good for him. It kept him from having another good guy in wrestling take it away from him. The bad guy got it.
However it happened, Harley ended up being the champion. And I think Harley was picked at first, to be the interim champion. And from my understanding, was only supposed to have the title maybe just a couple of weeks. But they had done such a great job in that interim that he had it for a couple of months. Dropped it to Jack, in Houston.
I just happened to be in the right spot at the right point in time.
July 1973 in Houston, Texas, Paul Bosch promoted the match between Race and Briscoe, where that Harley would then, turn the belt over to Jack. And for the occasion, they had a new championship belt made. Actually, a jeweler and a belt maker in Mexico had handcrafted it. And the belt that Harley was wearing and that had worn for his short period of time as champion in '73 went back to the 50s, and I believe the Thez Dick Hutton era. Kaniski and Dory and Pat O'Connor and Buddy Rogers had all worn that belt, so it was a heavy-duty piece of history. They changed the belt. The old belt, I think, had almost a 25-year run. Then the new belt, was instituted there.
Here's a belt that had been there for 100 years and it was going by, and here's a brand new one, and I was the person that had both of them.
Bosch did a great job in promoting that match. A new belt, Harley's a new champion, new era. And so Jack met Harley in 2 out of 3 falls, and interesting because Harley took the first fall, and usually the challenger would. And the whole match looked pretty much like Harley was just going to kind of breeze through Jack. Jack caught the second fall with the figure 4, and then at the end used the Luthez press to beat Harley the third fall and take the world title.
I think he earned a lot of credit and a lot of respect within the business for the way he handled himself in that situation, and a lot of the people within the wrestling business felt we kind of owe him something.
And I think that had a lot to do with him getting the title back again, was just the fact that he wasn't an interim champion like he was supposed to be. He took the title and he was the heavyweight champion of the world, and he portrayed that well, even in his first run.
At that point in my career, I realized how good I must have really have been to the rest of the wrestling world, and I'm talking about the promotional side of it. And I knew by taking it from Funk, keeping it for 3 months and dropping it to Jack Briscoe, that that point in time I had accomplished what I set out to do. Be called the best in the world of wrestling. And I knew that if I had been trusted for that volume and time, that eventually it was coming back, and it came back a whole lot of times after that.
Obviously, Harley didn't want to be known as a one-time champion or a short-term champion. So after that first run with the belt, he tried to do everything he could do to up his profile and his reputation with the fans of different territories and also with the promoters. So whether it be the Central States or St. Louis, also Florida, he spent time in Georgia, he went to the Mid-Atlantic area for the Crockett's. And in most cases, when he was wrestling in those territories, which were the creme de la creme of NWA territories, he was also in some way or another asked to help in the office, whether it be to help book or just to recommend talent or to line shows up. He still had his ownership interest out in Kansas City, so he was really not only increasing his reputation with the fans all over the country by going to all these main event top territories, and getting on as many television shows as possible, but also he was upping his reputation with all the different booking offices as somebody you could depend on, as somebody that was there to have some good ideas, that was a fellow promoter and owner. And that wrestling was a very hard business to get into in those days, but ownership, promoting, and booking was exponentially tougher. If there were 20 or 25 wrestlers in every territory, there were only 2 or 3 or 4 owners and bookers. So it was 10 times as hard to get into a business that was already 10 times as hard to get into. It was very difficult, and Harley did it in a variety of really top territories. So when Briscoe was ready to relinquish the belt. It came down basically to Harley and Terry Funk as to who was going to get the nod.
It came down to the voting, and it came down to the voting for who was going to be selected. And it came down to, I believe it was 4-4. And there were 8 members on the board, or I don't know how many members on the board, but I know that it was tied, half and half. And my brother stood up and said that he felt that I'd be a good person in there. And I'm certainly glad that he did, because it changed my life. And Fritz said, well, we're going with Terry then. And that's the way it went. And I'll tell you what, if I wouldn't have gotten in there then, I would have never gotten in there.
It was laid out to me that the Funk brothers, if they could put the belt on both of them, that I had 2 people to work with on a worldwide basis. And it truthfully, I didn't like it at that point in time, no. But truthfully, it worked out to be absolutely great, because I had 2 different people that I could go anywhere in the world with, and we drew money.
Terry said, you know, his thought was only to have it about a year or so.
I wanted to make as much money as quick as I could with the belt and be through with it. And the reason why, one of the reasons why, is that, you know, if you look at that belt, it was the #1 thing to be. But it was a hard-ass life. And I'm not talking about physically. It was a hard-ass life on your wife and your kids. And it always was that, and I realized that. And that's why I wanted to do what I did with it.
It was time finally to Harley to get his due, and that happened in February of 1977 in Toronto.
Which gave me talking points that no one else ever been in wrestling had. I took it away from both those Funks. I had started another Luthez type of run with the world's title.
World Heavyweight Champion, Harley Race.
The NWA belt was recognized throughout the world, and all except for the New York area.
The world champion then was legitimately was a world champion, you know, and he, you know, most of us that worked the territory, you were in the car. You know, I mentioned earlier about going to Minneapolis or Omaha, Nebraska, or wherever. It was always by car. You weren't flying any place at the time. But that champion was on an airplane a great deal of the time. And didn't spend a lot of time at home.
You're going everywhere in the United States, and then whatever countries recognized the belt, you're going there also. Right from the get-go, that's a pretty good run. You wrestled 365 days. If you didn't have enough guts to say, no, stop, I ain't going any further. And the longest you ever had off was 10 days. 99% of the time, it was 7 days. And if you didn't say no, there's 365 days in the year. You're going to wrestle 365 days. But I finally made a deal with him that I'll work 4 weeks in a row. 5th week I'm off. We'll start back with the 4.
It was a grueling thing back then. I mean, you're talking about doing doing 60 minutes every night, night after night after night after night after night after night, and giving 100% that much too on top of that.
My job was to go out there and have an outstanding wrestling match with whoever they put me in there with.
For Harley to come in to a different city every night, a different town every night, and work with those different guys and still be able to do it is just amazing to me. To take a guy that may have been over like $1 million but couldn't work a lick, but Harley made it believable in that town. Because that's why everybody came to the building, to see their guy beat the world champ.
It was probably one of the toughest schedules that any wrestler has ever undergone. They talk now about, well, the schedule's tough in the WWE, but they work 4 days a week. A lot of times this was 7 days a week. This was not exactly, first-class travel everywhere and limousines. It was a tough road schedule, and it was a tough ring schedule because Harley Race especially was the master of the long match. You had to be when you were the world champion. Dory did it, Terry did a lot of them, so did Flair, because that was still in vogue when Flair became the champion, is you wouldn't beat the top challenger in the main city in his territory, you'd go an hour Broadway. That meant that the local guy never got beat, that he was almost good enough. If he just had a little bit more time, he could have beaten the champion, and that led to rematches that were profitable when the next time champion came to the territory.
It is as tough as, it's really hard for me to explain, and I'm sure it'd be almost impossible for anyone else to believe that what you really do if you're out on that road, or whether you're in an airplane or a car.
When you had that world belt, everybody in our towns, because that world belt meant so much, everybody wanted to see the world champion. Everybody wanted to see the world champion. It doesn't matter if it's a small town. And yeah, we hear about Harley being in the big cities, but he was in as many small towns. Those people deserve to see that world champion too.
Harley could do it every night. Every night. And Harley could go 90 minutes every night. 60 minutes, 90 minutes, it didn't matter.
I mean, it was just a grueling schedule for any champion to have, which just, and I hope all the fans and everybody just realizes, having the title at that time, that's what it meant. It's different now, but to have to be somewhere every night by car or by plane, living by a schedule like that, and those elusive days off, there were supposed to be 2 or 3 days off, a week here or there, or a week off, every 3 months. And I think those were pretty much non-existent. I think those rare days off were extremely rare, because somebody always needed the champion for a show, a TV taping, or something like that.
The drive and determination for something like that's incredible, because he'd already been through a car wreck. He'd already been through a serious ankle break when he was wrestling in Tennessee. He'd already been through wrestling in the carnivals, and into that style of wrestling in the territories, and later in every territory, night after night. Harley Race is the Iron Man.
He was just tough, and it didn't matter, who he was going against. He was going to be in there for 60 minutes. He was going to give it his all, and he never stopped. But it wasn't a lot of high-flying things or anything like that. He could just wrestle, and that's what the world champion had to do back then. They had to be the guy who could really wrestle. And Harley was certainly in that ranks.
Harley, he's quite a character. He also considers himself the world's greatest beer drinker. He's the world's greatest everything, according to Harley. But the one thing about it is, he doesn't just think that. He believes it. And he knows he is, and I can drink a beer faster than anybody. I can beat up anybody. I can drive a car faster. I can do this. I can do that. That was Harley Race. You have to remember that. He could do it all. He could go ahead and knock somebody out quicker than anybody else. And I've seen him do that 100 times, too. He and I have been in a lot of bars together and cleaned them out.
I've been involved in several fights, and I haven't lost one yet.
I've seen him clean out a lot of bars. As he never took any crap off of anybody, in a bar or anywhere.
When not only all the top stars in the business, but also all the tough guys in the business tell stories about Harley Race being tough, when you got tough guys telling stories about somebody else being tough, that means they're tough.
even if you didn't think Harley was that tough, you wasn't going to find out. You know, you just believed it, you know. And I joke because I thought, well, I always wonder if Harley was as tough as everybody said. But he may not have been, but we were all too afraid to try.
You know, anybody in the business that would have tried Harley when he was 60 in any kind of real contest would have been out of their mind or drunk, one or the other. He had that reputation that, I don't care, after he had retired, even probably still today, if he got his grip on you, you know, nobody wanted to try Harley, out of the ring especially, in any kind of real contest. I mean, you know, as a guy, he's been stabbed breaking up robberies in bars and things like that. You know, everybody knew that Harley was not only tough in a working way as a professional and a performer in the ring, but Harley was tough as the real deal, and you respected that.
World's heavyweight champion, and which means that I can beat any man in the world.
There's really ain't a hell of a lot to tell. You know, you get involved in a barroom fight or whatever, whether it's a barroom fight in a bar or that type of thing in the ring out here. As long as you walk out there with your pants on and your hand in the air and the guy's laying out there in front of you, what the hell's the difference?
Harley was believable because he was the real deal. You know, he didn't have to act like the champion. He didn't have to act like a wrestler. He was.
He could drive 130 miles an hour. I was scared to death all the time, but he loved to drive that fast all the time. He could drive a car faster.
The way I drove, because I wanted to get from point A to point B, and to be able to do something here in point A and then have time enough left to do something when I got to point B.
The steering wheel, God bless him, was in one hand if it hadn't have been. But there was an amber bottle usually in the other hand.
It was just something that I enjoyed doing. I enjoyed driving to start with. I finished wrestling. I loved to have a couple of beers to put that sweat back in the body again. And I like to smoke. So I just put them all together and got behind the wheel and away we went.
Drinking and driving is, my God, he'd be driving 130 miles an hour. Everywhere that Harley went, he went as fast as he could go. One thing Harley did is he never left on time, but he always got there on time. Now, that's pretty hard to do.
It's nothing that I recommend you kids or anyone else doing.
The fact that he held the belt so long, even though he had brief breaks, Dusty had it for a few months, and he dropped it to Flair the first time and then got it back and set up Starrcade, etc. But when you think about it, for, you know, a period of several years, the NWA champion was most often Harley Race. He had to represent not only himself but the NWA all over the world in every territory, including Japan. I'm not sure there's enough money in the world if you didn't love what you were doing to make you do that.
When the NWA allowed Giant Bob into the NWA, what it also did, as you pointed out, was add to that load of places the world champion's got to go. He's going to have to go to Japan twice a year, 3 times a year, for 2 weeks, and he's going to work hard, and he's going to work tough matches every night, because that Japanese style is even tougher than what they're doing over here at certain places. So for the world champion, a Globetrotter probably understates it a little bit as what the world champion was.
The title changes in Japan with Giant Baba were obviously special cases, and for one thing, you'd be crazy to turn down the money. It was anywhere north of $25,000 just to, you know, do a job in a wrestling match. And also, Harley knew he was going to get it back.
He had asked me on several occasions about being able to, you know, do that, and he was a man of his word. If he told me X number of days, and that's exactly the way it went. And I did it the first time around because I knew that I was right at the point where they were ready to make a switch back here in the States and the NWA. Anyhow, I thought, well, why not? I'm going to pick up X number of dollars of cash. I don't have to give them 3% of. All goes in my pocket. It makes a guy super big in his country and his part of the world.
In the overall long term, if you look back at did it help professional wrestling or did it hurt professional wrestling? Hurt it. Hurt it. Because you're bouncing the thing around like a rubber ball.
It helped wrestling stay strong in Japan. Wrestling staying strong in Japan made American wrestlers a ton of money, some 6 figures a year in those days. So to keep wrestling strong in Japan, to keep Baba's company, who was affiliated with the NWA and used primarily NWA talent, to keep Baba's company strong, it was a good move. It made Harley a great payoff. It made Baba big as a wrestler and a businessman. I see nothing wrong with it.
Just to make that schedule, you know, to have all that pressure on you, you know, to produce, you know, night after night, you know, my goodness, he's just a double tough man to not only physically but mentally.
He had to come up the hard way. He had the school of hard knocks. So I think he just wanted it better. I think he wanted to prove that he deserved that position. So I think maybe that made him last a little bit longer than a lot of the other people. And I'm sure there were times when he had to feel it because that was just a brutal schedule.
I started out, and at 15 years old, I was driving a guy that weighed 700 pounds. And I had one thing in mind, and one thing only: the wrestling world.
With Harley, I guess it's just a little bit different, you know, kind of makeup. Not that he was tougher or better or more mentally tough than these guys, but just maybe just a different mindset.
Harley didn't care if there was 200 people there or 20,000. And believe me, he's been before both crowds. You understand what I'm saying? And I'll tell you what, I've never seen him short a fan on a performance, because he understood that those fans, whenever there were 200 there, had to pay that price to come through that gate to watch them, and they deserved a show, and he always felt that. Now you get some guys, and some of the guys in the business, they look around, see nobody out there. Well, their performance drops about 80%, but not Harley Race. Never have I ever seen him step in the ring and not just give 100% of his body to the wrestling fans.
What Harley Race meant to the NWA World Title was that it was credibility. Every fan that saw him, once again, he didn't play games, he didn't have funny one-liners. He had that face that he could look at you and you'd think, this guy's gonna, you know, break my arm off and use it for a toothpick. And he could back it up in the ring. So it was credibility.
One of the things that Harley had was serious. There was no catchphrases.
To you, me, it's coming down to where whatever I gotta do, I'm gonna beat you.
He was just the greatest wrestler on the face of God's green earth. And when he looked into that camera and told you that, if you were a wrestling fan, you believed it.
It was my life. It wasn't just a style, it was my life.
Believable. You know, that belt ain't worth nothing if you don't believe who's carrying it.
In my eyes, you know, the greatest world champion.
He was the last of that generation style of world champion that would be there for a long time, that would have strong matches that would go everywhere.
From his second run, you know, in '77, you know, till, you know, '87, '88, you know, I mean, if you looked up champion in the dictionary, you'd see Harley Race's picture.
Starrcade '83, it was such a fabulous night because it was the first of the big, you know, big show that, you know, it was before the WrestleMania.
I think at Starrcade '83, even though Harley would be a main event player for several more years, it was probably the passing of the torch.
Rick had the title, beat Dusty Rhodes, you know, in Kansas City. And his first title run was you know, kind of a lackluster And even according to Rick, it was. They decided to take the title, from Rick. And one reason Harley wanted it back, because Vince was starting to make his move.
It was Harley saying they're going to have to beat me, really beat me, to come into my territory. You have to know Harley. It was all about that. I had no problem losing the title to Harley at all. We had a great match. We had a better match in St. Louis than we had when I won it back. No, I loved working with Harley. I had no problem losing it either. I mean, in looking back on it, I've said this 100 times, I was a much better performer and much more skilled the second time I got it. Second time I got it, I knew where I was at. There was no, they were going to have to fight me to get it off me. But no, Harley wanted to be the world champion when those guys came knocking. And he was. And he told them. And nobody said boo, just so you know.
Anytime you were a world champion, you had a 10 grand deposit at whoever happened to be the president of the National Wrestling Alliance at that point in time had 10 grand of your money until they got the belt back. And I was not going to walk away from that 10 grand.
In the run-up to Starrcade, the first one, Harley was the NWA champion. Vince called him and asked him if he'd come to Connecticut for a meeting, and it didn't take a lot to figure out what that meeting might be. And Harley says that Vince offered him $250,000 to come on board, and didn't say anything about losing the belt or making his commitments, just come on board. Basically, he wanted to buy the NWA champion and obviously put him on the card and show that the WWF could take anybody. So Harley could have instantly gone from losing money to making money, but as the story he tells goes, he and Vince went in the restroom at the restaurant, and he looked in the mirror and said, "Vince, what do you see?" And Vince said, "I see us in this mirror." And Harley said
something about looking in that mirror and who do you see? And I got to look at that person for the rest of my life. Basically, that's still true today.
He wanted to keep the promotions that he was working with and for and had ownership in and owed things to strong as much as possible in the face of competition.
I never doubted it, but I didn't know he was there either.
You didn't even know he was there at the time?
No, nobody did. But I've been asked if I had any doubts about Harley. I never had any doubts about mine. What the issue became him being in New York and then that huge, we know that Crockett had not played closed circuit at all these venues. We had the worst snowstorm I ever remember down here. Remember, even went all the way from Savannah to Richmond. It was terrible, and now Harley couldn't get out of New York, and Harley got to the show about 8 or 8:30 or 9 o'clock. Crockett was a wreck. I was a wreck. But nobody knew where Harley was.
The closed circuit stuff in the theaters was the start of the whole big pay-per-view thing. And again, this spread, this puts you in places you could never be before.
Harley had seen Flair, obviously, coming in and out of the Carolinas. Flair had worked Atlanta. Flair had been to St. Louis, especially, where he had made a big name for himself. And Harley saw that this guy was the future. Obviously, Harley would be a master at spotting talent. I think he had to see that this guy was going to be the one to carry the NWA in the 80s. Harley got the belt the last time really as a long-term setup to relinquish it at Starrcade 83 and really that be the torch-passing moment. Because then Flair was pretty much the guy for the rest of the decade.
Well, I knew that as far as the world's title and stuff, I'd already had it 8 times, so I knew that part was going.
And then, of course, Gene Kiniski came in, former world champion, great wrestler, came in as special referee that night.
And everybody knew if he was the referee, something big was going to happen. And that's true, it did.
And Rick took the title and launched into the stratosphere with it. But again, Harley, willing to do it. Harley had enough stroke there. I mean, he could have probably chosen anybody that he would have wanted to, or he could have kept the title longer. But again, respect for the business, seeing the direction it was going in.
I think my relationship with him had a lot to do with it, but also I'll go on record as saying I think it could have been Joe Blow or Harley Race. He was a man of his word. He knew the convictions of being the champion. He knew it was his job, and you know, I want to think to myself that he did it just for me, but I think he would have done it for anybody.
Flair was very, very good at what he did. As far as being able to put butts in seats and stuff like that, Rick was very, very good at it.
So I think Harley realized that, and I think that's why they did it on the biggest show the NWA had ever attempted, because they wanted the most notoriety. They wanted the most number of people to see it live and on closed circuit. It went to a lot of the different territories on closed circuit, and up to that point, it was the most successful NWA show ever held. It passed the torch to a new generation of title holder, and Harley acquitted himself quite well in the process, and the build was incredible all over the world of wrestling.
There's not a damn thing that, in general, that I regret doing it.
Closed circuit, of course, gave birth to pay-per-view, and now you've got a WWE network. I mean, so it, you know, again, if you look back to an origin point, you know, it would have had to have been, you know, Starrcade, you know, in Greensboro, and again, who was in the main event? It was Harley Race.
At the time, then the mid-'80s, the territories were starting to feel the effects of the promotional war between Vince and the NWA, and Harley had a heavy money loss that he was staring at in the face in his Kansas City promotion. And so at that point, he had slowed his wrestling down somewhat. It was still featured as a main event player everywhere he went, but was trying to work on the promotion and saving that investment.
Well, he took over his father's company, and his father was truly a nice guy. Not saying Vince is not now, but he was a jerk back then. I was the one person that was involved in wrestling at that point in time that could see that he was going to be able to take it over.
And the territory days were, you know, coming to an end. And what Vince McMahon did was he would go in and do shows without buying the territory. You know, why would I have all this, why put in all this expense when I could come in and do the same thing? You know, hit some of the major cities, and then you go off to the next one. So the world had changed. The world was changing, and wrestling always had seemed to have kept up with that, or even be at the front of the curve as things changed. And in this case, they weren't.
You know, it was the same thing as Walmart.
Terry Funk was one of the greatest visionaries that I've ever met in this business. But I remember him talking about when cable television first started, that promoters better be careful because this is going to change the complexion of the wrestling business. And of course it did.
The National Wrestling Alliance and all the other places that call it, like Vern, the AWA thing, those people said they were going to do this or said they were going to do that, that they were forming a group that would stick together no matter what. That's all baloney.
We had the every week wrestling. We were there for all of that time. And all of a sudden, here comes the circus to town. And that's what the WWE was. I don't mean that by their guys being circus-like. They had great performers. And they brought them in just as the circus would come to town once or twice a year. Well, who's going to draw the big money? The show that comes once or twice a year. And they were capable of doing that because they had the money to support a national television.
And I think Vince McMahon saw the changes in television, the changes in communication coming, read them much better than anybody in professional wrestling otherwise did. I mean, he understood and could see what was going to happen and worked with the changes, where the other guys just wouldn't work with the changes. They couldn't believe it would happen. We were running a show in New York. We were running a show in Newark, New Jersey. If you remember, they ran that card up there. They had Gagne's people, Watts' people, and NWA people together. We'll run one show, and if we do that, that'll show Vince we're serious. We want him to stop. Vince laughed at him. They'll run one show and have a fight with each other about the payoffs, which is exactly what happened. So that took care of that.
It was a war. You know, there were promotional wars before, but, you know, somebody might come into your territory and try to unseat you. And obviously there was always a winner or a loser. But with this, Vince was at war with the Alliance. You know, and his famous saying is that they can't even agree on what they're going to have for lunch, never mind agree on how to fight me. He was aware of that, and as most of us were. You know, although they worked together, the Alliance members, they always were kind of looking over their shoulder too.
He was able to bring in films and show them to whoever it was that ran that particular television station, and said, I can give you this, where they were having to pay to have Sam do his television.
That pretty much did kill the territories.
It obviously ended up killing it, and it also killed the talent pool, and it's changed the business tremendously as well.
In the wrestling business, if you aren't putting butts in the seats out there, you're paying for the rent of the building, for the cost of the TV, whatever it was at that point in time. Each and every individual that's out there working for you, plus the referees, and you're paying for all that, and enough fans or people coming into the building, if that's not enough to pay for it, eventually you're going to say, oh, the hell with it. Walk away from it, and Vince has got it.
Why did Vern Gagne fight so hard in Minneapolis and lose all his money and go bankrupt? You believed you could stay alive. You believed you could win. Eventually your mind changed. You probably believed, I can sell it to him. And Vince was just moving on.
I think all of us were under the impression, well, this is just another promotional war, right? He's going to score a few points and he's going to lose a few, and it'll all settle down and we'll all go back the way it was. But of course that never happened, and it's changed the complexion of the business entirely now.
It was what he paid for by driving down the road night after goddamn night. Driving down the road night after night after night after night. Does he own Kansas City? Of course he doesn't. Does he feel like he owns it? You're damn right he does, because he feels like he paid for it. And paid for it with sweat, and paid for it with blood. And coming in there with that is absolutely irate, upset, torn apart, and not a thing that any of us could have done about it.
And I could see the NWA just falling apart. I could see Fritz Feinreich, who I've talked to too, telling me one thing, and then somebody else from the NWA, Jim Barnett, calling and telling me another thing. This isn't going to work. We're going in two different directions. Vince is going in one direction. It was a war they couldn't win.
It sounds silly to people today, to modern day fans and even modern day promoters, that people would care enough about wrestling matches to go and handcuff themselves to the door of the arena, or to go in and cause a fight amongst opposite promoters and opposition. But at that time, it was not only, it was people's livelihoods, it was the credibility of the business, it was, this is our property, you're infringing on our territory, this is ours. It's like somebody coming on your yard and starting to camp out and opening up their own lemonade stand. You know, you're doing business on my ground. That's the way that promoters in those days felt about their territories, and they should have, because that's why they protected them, and that's why business stayed strong as much as it did, because they didn't allow things that would be detrimental to the wrestling business when they realized what they were. Everybody makes mistakes. So Harley was quite verklempt at the thought that Vince McMahon was going to run in his territory, and showed up a couple of times and made sure that his presence was known, and could have done a lot worse if he'd have been a mind to, but obviously cooler, saner heads prevailed. But nobody was going to mess with Harley. They might call the police on him, but they weren't going to do it themselves.
I've never told that story in its entirety, and I'm not going to do it now.
I think Harley Race would handcuff himself, and they're lucky that he didn't have a double-barrel shotgun in his pants.
Well, in general, I went down there and jacked with him, and I guess by doing it, it kind of proved to them that I was capable of doing different things, and that I had the wrestling business was Harley Race. When it comes to talking about a gun and getting by with it, one time around I was lucky enough to do that, so this time around I'm not going to run that risk of saying anything about a gun and saying to the whole world that I did it.
He's protecting his life. It was very, I mean, it wasn't easy for anybody, from Don Owens to anybody, you know. I mean, it was a different time and a different era in the business, and we wanted it to stay as it was.
I think everybody took it with a grain of salt initially. What, are you crazy? You know, what, this is not going to work. But it did.
They believed they could stay alive. They could believe that somebody would make a deal at the end, probably later on as they were hurting. And I'm just surmising this. I don't know if this is a fact. But they probably were thinking, well, Vince made a deal with Hart, Stu Hart. He's going to pay him some money to buy out. Maybe he'll buy us out. Yeah, we're still waiting for Vince to buy some of these territories out, aren't we? That wasn't going to happen. He's going to bury you. And that's what happened. And then they had a deal, I believe, with Jim Crockett, where Crockett worked with them, and what was still called the St. Louis Wrestling Club, but that didn't last long.
And that's ended up what led to him going to the WWF.
I had the opportunity to go with Vince quite a while. Well, I didn't know for absolute sure that the NWA was done, but they were starting to do a lot of internal fighting. I wasn't ready to quit and get out of wrestling, because wrestling was the only thing I'd ever done in my life. And in order to keep that going and to keep myself going, the next move was to go into Vince's.
One more star. You got Dory Funk Jr. You got Terry Funk. Who didn't he get? He got them all. Eventually, didn't he? So he's always had the door open. I mean, he just was going to lure every star there. And because of the way the marketing was set up, the promotion was set up, they can make more money with Vince.
He was probably conflicted in terms of when he went to the WWF and worked for Vince McMahon.
Well, there's a super tough decision to make, because I was walking away from a ton of people that had been my friends and had supported me virtually my entire lifetime.
But he didn't just walk out. He announced it at the NWA meeting that he was going to be going to work for Vince McMahon. He didn't make any secret about it. He didn't show up as a surprise and you know, undercut anybody. He told him, this is what I've got to do. You know, I'm sorry, but it's what's best for me, and he was straight up with it. So I've got no problem with that, because it's a free country, and I think he realized if he kept the ties to the people that he was working with, he was probably going to end up on the losing edge of the scenario.
The smart thing for me to do was to go with who I knew was going to be eventually the winner in this fight. And to do that, I called him and I said, how would you like me to come in? And that would be like saying, how do you like to win this war?
And I was actually surprised that he ended up going to work later on. And, I mean, but he was so respected. I'm glad he did. But Harley was not shy about telling you what he thought. And he would not, if he said it to you, he'd say it to your face, which you couldn't help. You couldn't knock him for that. And no, I don't think Vince ever disrespected Harley for standing his ground.
At that point, you would have been completely insane to change Harley Race's name. That's one of the reasons why, at that point, that Vince McMahon would have wanted Harley Race to wrestle for him, is because he had such incredible name recognition in all the NWA markets. And let's face it, the places that Vince McMahon was not succeeding in terms of drawing houses in the 80s were the key NWA markets. That's where he needed help. He had the West Coast. He had the AWA territory. He had the Northeast. But he was bombing in the southern states and in most of the key NWA territories, and he needed as many talents on his card that would draw NWA traditional fans as possible. So to change Harley Race's name would have been crazy. Now, that's not to say they didn't mess around with his presentation. Handsome Harley Race, I think even he would probably admit at that point, as he was probably around 50 years old at that time, that probably wasn't an accurate description, even more so than when he was Handsome Harley Race in the AWA, you know, almost 20 years before that. Then he won the King of the Ring, and he became King Harley Race.
Generally, he wanted to play down, he wanted to embarrass the NWA. I mean, you know, he didn't push them as NWA champions or former world champions.
The King, Harley Race the King. It was, I think he always believed that that was to put him in his place, right? Because he'd turned him down the first time. But I also remember him saying to me, and I made my mind up, I was going to make the damn best of this. You know, it wasn't going to get me down. They weren't going to humiliate me with it. I'm going to make it work. And he did.
And I you know, obviously from being there, I'm sure part of the discussions were, but Vince, he has no color, he has no personality, he just goes out and wrestles and is the toughest guy in the world. Well, how could we possibly use this in professional wrestling? You know how that goes. So they had the robe and the crown and the scepter, and it was an attempt to, in their view, give him more character and personality. But I don't think it was an insult. I think they meant it wholeheartedly, and I think he probably went along with it because at that point, why not?
But Harley made it work. That was, and he did it with respect. He never, Harley Race never turned into a clown.
Harley Race, after the way he looked, come out there, the crown, looking all silly like that was to make people, and I know it was because I heard him talk about it in the office. I mean, I know it was, you know, oh, well, Harley, well, we get a little laugh out of that, get a little chuckle. Well, Harley overcame that because he was that much better. He was that good. He was that tough. He had that much respect. He kind of made the King thing become kind of serious.
If all of the car wrecks and the boat accidents and the bumps and the injuries weren't enough, talk about being hardcore wrestling wasn't even invented yet. Harley Race was breaking tables, but he made it make sense. He had a match one night in the WWF with Randy Savage, and he planted Savage on the table, and he said, "Move, kid," and he came off with a diving headbutt off the turnbuckles, and Savage moves and he goes through the table. Well, Vince sees it and freaks out and wants him to do it with Hogan. And he does it with Hogan in 4 or 5 matches.
And the whole damn thing collapsed, and I went right on through it, and knock on wood, a board didn't break in the wrong direction and go through right on through me and out the other side. But for all the people that saw it live happening right there, it was a hell of a thing to them. And it damn sure was to me, because I had no earthly idea that table was going to crunch and I was going to go right on through it.
One of the metal edges caught him in the stomach, and he thought nothing of it, and kept going and began having increasing abdominal pains, ended up in the hospital, blacked out, emergency surgery, almost in a colostomy bag from the damage he did to himself, and was able to nip up out of that, as the Nature Boy would say. He nipped up out of that and resumed wrestling.
I wound up with a scar about that long. It eliminated, virtually eliminated Harley Race and the way people looked at Harley Race. They were used to me doing things that they'd never seen anyone else do. And I pretty much tucked that out of my own thing. You know, it eliminated me too.
His time with the WWF, he overcame being marginalized as to a lesser performer than he was. He was a good enough performer that during that time he showed that he was one of the greats, which was hard to do with the WWF at that time. It's unfortunate that injury cut it off.
When Harley obviously wound his in-ring career down with that WWF run, and pretty much by the late 80s, he was done as an active in-ring wrestler. But he came back in the early 90s as a manager in WCW. And obviously WCW was the remnants of the NWA. He felt more at home. He knew some people there, but also managing Vader and managing Lex Luger, two guys who were still green. Lex had been wrestling several years, but still could obviously learn something, as everybody could, from Harley Race, and especially Vader, who'd been a football player, was a tough guy on his own, but had only been wrestling a few years. Putting Harley Race in their corner and putting him with them in the car, on the road, so that he could impart that wisdom, not only here's how you do this, but here's why you do this, and here's what you should do at this time, and here's how you should carry yourself. I'm sure it definitely benefited both men's careers.
I did have fun with it.
You still got to see Harley Race, and that brought back a lot of good memories, and you knew these guys that he was going to be in their corner, going to be tough, or Harley Race wouldn't be there.
Not only did I get to be a very good friend of his in that period that we spent at the WCW, but it was just a true blessing for me. He knows how to tell you what you did wrong and how you did it wrong and why you did it wrong, but then also have the knowledge to suggest, what maybe you should have done.
As a manager, he wasn't there to do promos as much as to be a ringside presence, credibility, stability, a mentor in and out of the ring, and I think that was the perfect usage of Harley Race at that point in his career.
What to say in a lot of for instances, talk to him about how to lead and have a wrestling match.
The thing with me that I respected so much about him was that he never really confronted me in front of the other guys. When I was there just a short time, and Dusty Rhodes was the booker, and said, "Hey, this is Harley Race, and you guys are together." And we immediately started riding together on the road. Rented a car. He would stay in a room on the road. I would stay next to him, and we developed a very, very good relationship, a strong relationship, one made of trust and certainly respect on my part.
I think he had a credibility to the guys he was managing.
The one thing that he did was he would wait till we were alone and said, that's where he would, he said, "You want to talk a little wrestling?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he would, "So, here you did this, and why didn't you do this?" And I said, "I don't know. Maybe that's what I should have done." And, things like that. And he wouldn't just correct me, but he would, "Hey, and when you did this, that was fantastic. I didn't know which way you were headed there, and you did this, and that was very good."
So when you put the credibility of a 8-time world champion in Harley Race out beside this 350-pound monster in Vader, I mean, you created an image of something that was unstoppable, unbeatable.
For me, it changed my career. That run in the WCW certainly would have not been that successful. Just, I, in my opinion, I had a hell of a run in WCW. A great time in my life, and obviously, my respect goes out to Mr. Race and what he did for me during that period.
Well, it was more or less proven to myself and to everybody else that I could do it and make him look the part, and I think we accomplished it.
But all in all, for me, it was just a tremendous opportunity, tremendous break, and I'll be forever grateful for that time that I had Mr. Harley Race at my side.
It was kind of fitting that Harley's last official match in front of people was against Ric Flair. and it happened when he was managing Vader for WCW, and it was scheduled to be Vader versus Flair, but Vader missed his plane, and they were scrambling to find a replacement, and they came up to Harley and said, would you work with Flair? Sure. So, well, what are you willing to do? And Harley looked at him and said, I can't go an hour anymore, but I can go 30 minutes, and I'm not going to let him beat me. So they went 30 minutes Broadway.
Flair, whether you want to believe it or not, was a very, very capable guy. And he had a thing about him that he knew how to get people to hate him. He knew how to get people to like him. And for his ear, he was as good as anyone else out there. He knew I was not going to do anything to insult him, and he knew that if he walked out of the ring as a winner of a Harley race, he was shooting his credibility way up.
Well, you know, it shows after, you know, the schedule we've talked about, all the accidents, all the injuries, and being pretty much only active sporadically over the previous couple of years, that he could still go out and do that. And I'm sure that Rick obviously didn't hold him to a pace that he would have held Steamboat to, but still it was a main event match that you know that Harley took a lot of pride in, and if he hadn't taken pride in it, he wouldn't have said, we'll go 30 minutes.
At some point in life, you cannot go on living like you were when you were in your teens and in your 20s and in your 30s. You gotta start moving backwards. And all through my career, I never found that spot until I was at the age where the spot found me. At some point, you got to say, I cannot push this any further. And I did not want to go out as being remembered, look at that wore out old asshole. I wanted to go out of it on top of it. And I think it did a pretty good job at that. A chance to see, talk to, and be taught by the greatest there ever was.
Harley believes in teaching the fundamentals, as do I, to learn how to be a professional wrestler first, and then he can become a sports entertainer later.
Yeah, lean forward a little further.
Yeah.
If you can survive as long as I survived doing what you love to do, if you can teach that to the younger kids coming into it, they're going to enjoy what they do for a living.
If you want to be a sports entertainer, I don't know if I'd go to Harley Race's school, but if you want to be a professional wrestler, I would be happy to go to Harley Race's school.
One of the greatest decisions of my life, and that's the truth. Being here at this academy has gotten me the opportunities that I would have never ever gotten to do if I had not attended here. I would not have spent 3 months in Japan.
You can never learn too much, and to be able to go out there, I'm looking forward to going out there. They got a beautiful facility.
If I was going to go someplace, I'd go up here to Harley.
Any time you can get a chance to be around that type of knowledge and experience, if you want to be a wrestler, that's the place to be.
Who else would you want to get trained by? You know, if you want to learn the business and the ins and outs, this is where it's at. And if you want to be trained properly.
You guys, if you want to be a professional wrestler, you've got to get a background. You've got to get your feet on the ground. You've got to learn what's going on.
Harley has trained and helped train in these camps a lot of good talent. But he's the guy, he's not going to take somebody just because they want to be a wrestler and they're 125 pounds and have a check. He takes guys that he thinks he can do something with.
to be a quality professional wrestler, the fundamentals of this business haven't changed, I don't think, or shouldn't have, since Harley and I broke into business. If you put the good basic fundamentals in place and learn them properly, then you can be whatever's necessary to be that versatile performer that can, if it's high flying or if it's good mat-based wrestling, what's necessary, then you can do that. And I think that's invaluable to young guys trying to get in the business, and that's something you'll learn at Harley's camps.
He has a lot to teach. If they listen, they can learn something.
If you want to be a great professional wrestler, this is the place to be. You got a guy who has literally been there and done it all across the world. And he's right here teaching us.
What do you say, Dustin? Huh? What do you say, kid? Nope.
Harley was a man's man. He was a man who loved the business, had ultimate respect for the business, defended the integrity of the kayfabe and the shoot aspect of what we did.
He was a great in-ring performer. And whenever I say great, he was one of the all-time greatest.
Harley Race, the Iron Man, you can't stop him.
If anyone ever entered the ring and faced Harley Race and said he wasn't one of the toughest men alive, they'd be lying.
As a hell of a world champion, a gentleman, and a guy who brought a lot of class to the belt and to the business.
Harley will pride himself the rest of his life on being NWA champion, as we all do. How many guys were the NWA champion?
This man was the heavyweight champion of the world. There's no greater title.
I think probably the greatest world champion ever.
Harley, brother, was, I'm telling you, in the top 5 of, brother, of all the performers in our business.
It was the Harley Race era. For 10 years, nobody could beat him. He held the belt with dignity and respect, had a knowledge and love for the business I think that was second to none.
What Harley is he's a student of hard knocks. If you're going to tell me to name some phenomenal wrestlers from the era that I was in, Harley Race would definitely be one, and be right up there.
The fans of that era probably shortchange him simply because he was the guy at the time that was the glue that made everybody else look good.
Legendary tough guy, and I don't think, I don't remember anyone really ever going out there and challenging him. It had that type of reputation. So, in other words, Harley was the man and he ran the show.
One of the all-time greats, one of the legitimate tough guys, somebody who kept the business at a high plane and wanted to keep it there, wanted it to be respected, and wanted to be respected himself. He should be totally right there at the top.
To the fans, he was never the flashy guy, the face of wrestling, the stereotypical pro wrestler that you would see on network television or appearing on a game show or doing a guest appearance. He was the guy that night after night came in and had an incredible match and actually didn't get the credit from the fans in the days before they were smart, because when you had a match with Harley Race, you looked so good, it looked like that you were the greatest wrestler in the world. So the fans were like, why can't they beat that Harley Race?
Harley commanded respect.
Harley Race's legacy, the world's fastest beer drinker, the world's fastest car driver, the world's greatest everything. And I'll tell you what, I think he is.
One of the toughest guys to ever lace up a pair of boots, but also one of the most dependable, one of the most accomplished, and the legacy that he leaves probably is just that Harley Race was a stand-up guy for the talent, for himself, and for the wrestling business in general.
Harley Race was one of the ones that had something special.
So Harley definitely defined the championship in the late 70s and the early 80s.
He just carried a different aura about him, and when he came in that belt and just his simple warm-up jacket, but then he started taking all those amazing bumps, and also when he was on the offense, you believed it. I'm sure the guys he was working with believed it too. He was a level above. You knew you were seeing somebody that you were it was special that he was on the card. It was special that you were getting a chance to see him in person.
He's Mr. Wrestling. From A to Z, he can coach you, and then he could do it.
His fingerprints are on wrestling today, and the sport wouldn't be what it is today if there hadn't been a Harley Race.
The greatest wrestler on the face of God's green earth.
Meanwhile, Harley Race just defenseless up there in the ring, and here comes the world champion. The world champion, Nature Boy Ric Flair, looking at the proceedings. I don't know if he is aware now, a big grin on his face, as if to say, hey, don't make it that easy for me. And here comes the world champion. The world champion, Nature Boy Ric Flair, looking at the proceedings. I don't know if he is aware now, a big grin on his face, as if to say, hey, don't make it that easy for me.
This event is one fall with a 60-minute time limit. This match is for the World's Heavyweight Championship.
Oh, they cannot let
Introducing
this
the
go
challenger
on.
from Leawood, Kansas, weighing 263 pounds, Harley Race. His
Johnny
opponent
Myers.
from Minneapolis, Minnesota, weighing 242 pounds, the World's Heavyweight Champion, Nature Boy Ric Flair.
They cannot let this match go on. There is no way. Flair coming right out like a vulture. He smells blood and Race out onto this arena floor. And Flair is down. He is being counted out. What a bizarre turnabout. The crowd chanting, Harley, Harley. And Flair begging for mercy. But he gets a left hand instead. Here comes Flair off the ring rope. Up he goes. Wait a minute. What's he going to do? Down he comes. Oh, and Ric Flair just twitching. There's a headbutt. Oh, and Ric Flair is hurt. And now, Ric Flair again begging Harley Race. He misses. Oh, an uppercut by Harley Race. This has turned into a Pier 6 brawl. A right hand, a left hand, another left hand.
10 minutes expired.
There goes Flair into those ring turnbuckles. Look out, sleeper hold. Harley Race trying to put Ric Flair out. Could the world title change hands here on All-Star Wrestling? Harley Race trying to win an unprecedented 8th world title. He is very, very close as he tries to put Ric Flair to sleep. He is trying to put the world champion to sleep and wrest the world title from Nature Boy Ric Flair. Flair doing everything in his power to stay awake. Ooh. Flair. Now get up together, but Race takes a shot and dishes one out. Oh, look at Flair. He's mad. He is mad. But so is Harley Race. Now Flair backed up into that ring turnbuckle. A cut is open on the forehead of Ric Flair. Well, this is about what you'd expect. Look out. Pile driver. Yes. And Flair is down. He is not getting up. Will Harley Race win an unprecedented 7th world title? The count is 2. No. 2.5. Will Harley Race win an unprecedented 7th world title? The count is 2. No. 2.5. Race thought he had it. There's a chop. Whoops. Reverse neckbreaker. And Flair is down again. Flair thought this match would be a piece of cake. It has been anything but that. And a headbutt. Oh, look at the agony on the face of Ric Flair. Will Race get the pin? No, he's going to dish out a couple of fists in the forehead of Ric Flair. Now going for the pin. 1, 2, no. That left shoulder came up off the mat. Again, Race goes for the world title. He does not get it. A wicked gash over the forehead of Ric Flair. Whoa! And Harley Race up over that top ring rope. His own momentum carried him over the top ring rope, so it is not a disqualification. Harley Race being counted out on the arena floor. But Flair goes out right after him. Here comes Flair off those ring ropes. A block by Race. Oh, right hand. And a left. Oh, and Ric Flair. He is hurt. Oh, look at that. This match, I wouldn't have given a nickel for this match earlier, but Race is right in it. He is in it. And he is just that close to winning an unprecedented 8th world title. These
15 minutes expired.
But on this occasion, considering what happened before this match even began, Harley Race with the match of his life, headbutting Ric Flair again, trying to headbutt him into submission. Now Race, he's going for it all, headbutting Flair. And that might be all for the world champion. Oh! Harley Race. And now Flair steps out. Ooh, but a headbutt from the champion. Up off off that top ring rope. He takes a fist. And again, Ric Flair up off that top